in this episode.
One of my spiritual uh, events was actually a dream where God spoke to me and said, I do not exist. And so interesting, we've got almost like two different spiritual experiences here, which has obviously led me more to the radical and Matt more to the process. Because, in radical theology, there is an emphasis really on discontinuity and alienation and uh, a type of inexistent God. So my kind of formative spiritual experience was not the oneness of everything, um, and not some sort of organic unity or kind of teleological omega point that we're moving towards, but kind of like a primordial negation, um, and a direct kind of tarrying with that primordial negation.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation between the philosophers Peter Rollins and Matthew David Segall. It's just really cool, man. I mean, yes, I've had both Matt and Peter on the podcast before, but it just is really cool kind of breaking the parasocial relationship and talking to them in person because, as I've already told this to them, I've been following their work for years. I mean, Peter, I remember I probably came across him 5 years ago, and at the time I was reading, C.S. Lewis, Chesterton. I was even reading like a bit of the medieval philosophers like Aquinas and Augustine, and then also at the same time more in the contemporary scene, let's say people like William Lane Craig and Plantinga from systematic theology. So I was reading all of these people in theology and philosophy, and then suddenly I come across Peter's work, this notion of radical theology, and it was so bizarre to hear or like listen to the way he speaks of God and religion and how it pertains to kind of our condition. And then through him, I think I was introduced to many other thinkers like Paul Tillich and many more thinkers, and just it really did uproot me in a very. I'm thinking of the word here. I don't want to say good because that's a bit too tepid or even trite. But perhaps the word is in a very necessary way in my thinking and then in my being. And I think that's in many ways the goal of Pyrotheology and Peter's project. And then, of course, I think Matthew, people probably know him better as Footnotes to Plato, is really one of those OG online philosophers. I mean, his lectures on German idealism were the first lectures I watched when I came across Hegel and Schelling, and then, of course, Whitehead. So yeah, these two are just two people I've been following for years, and just it still is a bit surreal that I get to moderate these conversations, and just yeah, how generous they are with their time amidst their personal projects and writing and thinking. And I'm sure they get heaps of these podcast requests from online philosophy bros. In any case, it really was great. Of course, again, forgive me for the trite comment that really needs no saying, but still, let's call it as a bit of due diligence. This, even though I did sort of initially propose this conversation as a sort of dialectic, not in the Hegelian sense, I mean literally as the negative or pyrotheology of Peter and then the process theology of Matthew and Whitehead. It, of course, is simply putting two views on the table and seeing where the differences are and where the similarities lie. And perhaps there really aren't any similarities, but probably the truth is in the differences themselves. That being said, though, of course, this wasn't meant to be any kind of debate. You'd see from the conversation, it was very cordial and congenial, and really, both Matt and Peter were trying to understand each other's positions and these different metaphysical worldviews. And no doubt this conversation was very metaphysically meaty, and in fact, Matt wrote a reflection on it after the dialogue on his Substack. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes to the piece. It was brilliant, so I hope both of them did really feel there was some kind of intellectual stimulation through exploring these views. Be that as it may, now a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said, though, forgive me for the tautology. We, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some kind of financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider financially supporting this podcast through Patreon, Substack, or PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering what are the perks, what are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall perks. You're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's publicly available is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters on Patreon, Substack, and even PayPal. However, if you're considering supporting the project, please do so only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. Professor Matthew David Segall is a transdisciplinary researcher, writer, and philosopher applying process-relational thought across the natural and social sciences as well as in the study of consciousness. He is the associate professor in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco and the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. Professor Segall has authored many books, including Crossing the Threshold, Etheric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead, and is the creator of Footnotes to Plato. Dr. Peter Rollins is a philosopher and radical theologian working through the tradition of apophatic theology, Freud, Lacan, Hegel, and Žižek. He has a PhD dealing with post-structural theory from Queen's University, Belfast, and is the author of numerous books, including How Not to Speak of God and the Idolatry of God. Dr. Rollins is the creator of Pyrotheology, which is a life technology that involves a deep critique of any religious or ideological system that promises an escape from doubt and anxiety. On the note, I must mention Wake, a 5-day transgressive festival that Peter runs, mixing intellectual exploration with underground art, music, magic, comedy, tours, and talks to forge an experience that embodies the destabilizing essence of pyrotheology. You'll find all the details in the show notes. With that being said, here's a conversation with Peter Rollins and Matthew David Segall. I mean, I don't know, I've been following your work for years. In fact, Peter, as you know, you're like one of the first people in theology I read, and when I even knew who the hell Hegel was, it was your series, Matt, I watched on YouTube like maybe now 6, 7 years ago. And so in all those years, I've kind of almost like immersed your line of thinking into my own, let's call it thinking or perhaps even subjectivity. Um, and that's where, I've sent a few questions and I just want to see like, through a few ideas that you both and see where this goes really. But I don't know if this is okay, Matt, because I know it's a personal thing for you, but if I'm sure Peter would appreciate this too. You recently said that you had a bit of a renewed relationship with Christ, and maybe, I mean, I guess you could call it a testimony. If you could just maybe share with us what that looks like for you and probably just talk about it. I think it'll be a lovely place to start this conversation.
Hmm. Sure, yeah. Um, I don't know how recent it really was. I mean, it's something that uh, happened to me as a 19-year-old. So 20 years ago at this point. But I've definitely been talking about it more because there seems to be definitely here in the US, but it seems also in the UK perhaps. I'm not sure about the rest of Europe, but a renewed interest in Christianity and many public conversions. Often people who have these conversion experiences point to the what they perceive to be the cultural importance of traditional Christianity. None of that at all was relevant for me when I was a 19-year-old. At the time, I was um, very much critical of the biblical traditions. My mom's a bit of evangelical herself. My dad's a atheist Jew, though in dialogue with me over the years, he's realized he's more of an agnostic actually. But and so as a teenager, I really ran away from my mother's Christianity and embraced a kind of abrasive, self-assured, somewhat obnoxious form of atheism and scientific materialism and Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins. Like as a teenager, those were my guys. And then, yeah, when I was 19 years old, I got a hold of some psilocybin mushrooms for the first time, and was just in my dorm room alone. I told my roommate what I was doing, and if I need you, I'll let you know, but I'm just going to stay in here and journal. And yeah, I ingested those, and as I said, it was my first time doing any sort of a psychedelic. More context, at the time I was calling myself a Buddhist and meditating, and it was a very Americanized, like California type of Buddhism. It was like reading Alan Watts and Chogyam Trungpa and into Allen Ginsberg and the whole learning about the 60s counterculture and all of that stuff. And to my great surprise, that entire experience was something of a encounter with what I could call, maybe in a Jungian sense, the Christ archetype, which maybe makes it a little bit more approachable, but it didn't feel like a projection of my psyche. It felt like a being who sort of was hovering just behind my own face, and I was, journaling, as I said, and it felt like a kind of automatic writing, where this being communicated to me through me that it was the Logos, and that I say it. I don't necessarily want to gender Christ, though usually we say he, but that feels inappropriate. But I also don't want to impersonalize it. But this being said, I am in you, I am in everyone. Um, and it shook me. It overwhelmed me, not only because it was quite surprising. I had been spending, most of my teens making fun of Christianity as the uniquely uh, incredible religion of all the world religions, what it would require one to believe to take seriously. And then to have this experience humbled me, and I realized subsequently studying um, Christianity and Judaism more deeply that there's also an esoteric, mystical stream in the West, and I didn't need to go to these Asian religions to find that, which might be obvious to a lot of people now that there's um, mysticism in all the great world's religions that is often considered heterodox or blasphemous by the mainstream tradition. And so, yeah, since then, I would say I'm still deeply Buddhist on some level, but there's something about the incarnational vector that I intuit in um, this Christ being that strikes me as extremely important, that you can get from Buddhism, like in the Bodhisattva's vow, like this return to the suffering of the world. And so I don't mean to say that this is an exclusively Christian thing, and many Christians are so otherworldly and don't have that incarnational impulse at all. Um, but yeah, that's, the last 20 years have involved a ever deepening relationship. And I think what you're noticing, Rahul, more recently is that I'm talking about this more because all of a sudden, rather than it being very uncool to be Christian, it seems now very cool to be Christian. It's um, a rather surprising but dramatic shift that's occurring. And I'm a bit worried about the reasons people are listing for why they're converting at this point. It seems to miss the point to me, but maybe we can get into that later.
Thank you for sharing. That was fascinating. Yeah, I did lots of questions and thoughts on that, but that's very, very, especially because I'm going to keep saying this. I'll say it only once, so I don't have to say it again. But my limited understanding of process is that process theology is, and you mentioned this in the podcast I was listening to, so I feel secure in saying it. But process theologians are the ones who really kept Whitehead alive and vibrant for a long time. I lived with Trip Fuller for a year or more, and
Oh, he's a good
he's a
friend of mine. Yeah.
oh yeah, he's a dear friend. I haven't seen him for years now, but we lived together for a year in Torrance, and we did many podcasts together. So I know that people like John Cobb, kept Whitehead alive. So it's interesting that your interest is not just in process philosophy and Whitehead, but you have that theological bent. Can I ask very quickly, did that which came first? Your interest in process philosophy or your personal kind of religious experience?
Uh, this experience came first,
Yeah.
and as a 19-year-old, I'd probably heard of Whitehead, but I didn't study Whitehead formally until graduate school. So 2 or 3 years later. Yeah.
So Whitehead gave you a frame potentially to understand what was happening or what had happened. Is that correct?
On some level, but I didn't get into Whitehead initially through his theological interpreters like John Cobb and David Ray Griffin and Charles Hartshorne. Like I actually read them much later. I went straight into Whitehead's primary texts and was far more interested in the ways that his metaphysics allowed me to reinterpret science in a less, reductionistic, materialistic way. And then more recently, as I became friends with John Cobb about 10 years ago, and really developed a deeper appreciation for his work through that kind of mentorship, working with his institute, that I became more vocal about the theological aspects of Whitehead's work. But initially, it wasn't the theology that got me into his process philosophy. Yeah.
Interesting. Now that's cool because I was kind of almost assuming, oh, maybe it was the theology and then the philosophy, but no, you are a pure Whiteheadian, and came to the process theology later. Very interesting. Sorry, anyway, just that's me, Rahul. This is your podcast. You are responsible for this, so I'll let you ask the questions.
Guilty as charged. No, I was gonna ask Peter if you want to just comment on that. I'm sure, given the work you've been doing, you've heard similar kind of testimonies or perhaps even anti-testimonies, how people feel out of religion. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on what Matt shared.
Yeah, so and it actually comes. I was kind of interested in exploring, the areas of potential similarity and the things that we share in common. But interesting, starting here is interesting because in my around the same age, was 17 years old. I had what is, called a type of religious experience, which is not an experience as such, but what transforms your experience of everything. And that was very fundamental to me as well. So that's very interesting. But one of my spiritual uh, events was actually a dream where God spoke to me and said, I do not exist. And so interesting, we've got almost like two different spiritual experiences here, which has obviously led me more to the radical and Matt more to the process. Because, in radical theology, there is an emphasis really on discontinuity and alienation and a type of inexistent God. So my kind of formative spiritual experience was not the oneness of everything, um, and not some sort of organic unity or kind of teleological omega point that we're moving towards, but kind of like a primordial negation, um, and a direct kind of tarrying with that primordial negation. So yeah, so interesting, Matt. The little bit of, as I say, kind of research I've done or thinking is it feels like potentially some of your work would be more in line. It's interesting you mentioned Jung, because I would potentially be, say, for example, more Jungian than Freudian, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, and more Deleuzian than Lacanian. Um, and then again, that's probably where there's an interesting difference in our, respective projects. But very interested to unpack that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I've read very little Lacan. I've read more Žižek than Lacan and Žižek on
Yeah.
Lacan. But I definitely am more at home in Jung. Deleuze is very influential for me as well. So, but yeah, that dream you had is it's quite a Hegelian comment. God to say, I do not exist. Nice double negative
Yes.
going on there. Um, Double negation. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I I love, like Paul Tillich. I love the existential approach to um, theology and recognizing this the nature of desire as a lack that like can never be fulfilled. And um, I do resist sort of Pollyanna accounts of the relationship between um, God and the world, and I don't think that there is. I don't want and resist the idea that faith can become some sort of escape hatch from dealing with human the complexities of human relationship. Um, and I think, like Zizek's account of Jesus becoming an atheist on the cross is quite compelling to me. And I think that speaks to the profound transformation that this event is uh, supposed to signify, and not just signify, but to have accomplished in some sense that the divine became human. And so God died, uh, but something was resurrected, and like that's the spirit of humanity in some sense. And that, now it's up to us. We can't rely on this uh, transcendent being to intervene and fix the world for us. And so, what I like about process theology is it basically says God is not all powerful. And to the extent that God does have any power, it comes through um, us. And so faith becomes a way of lending a hand to the divine in a way, to live as best we can lives of love, and in so doing, um, God becomes more real in a way, right? And to the
Yeah.
extent that we don't uh, live in that way, God's reality is diminished. So it's a fully participatory type of theology that's not about petitioning some all-powerful being to make it all right. That type
Yeah,
of
I think
God does not exist.
absolutely. I've actually been rereading the later Bonhoeffer for some stuff I'm doing, and in the letters and papers. And I think this is maybe a place of potential connection for us. I don't know if you've read later Bonhoeffer. Later Bonhoeffer is the only Bonhoeffer I like, but it's very much what you're saying. It's the weakness of God. It's a participatory kind of theology in which it's living, what he calls religionless Christianity and worldly Christianity. And I think that there's a real connection between process and radical in that kind of material kind of way, and also in its here I'll throw out a few things that I think there's similarities in, then we can get to some of the differences. I mean, one of the things that Žižek says, maybe is a difference, but is Žižek says the joke of Christianity is that a person basically is sitting in the pew saying, I want to be one with God, but I feel alone and destitute, utterly in the dark, utterly bereft. And of course, God says, now you're one with me. Right. So for me, that's the joke of Christianity. It's not that you enter into a kind of, oneness with God or something, but you participate in a fundamental ontological alienation. But what process and radicals seem to both have is one is there's a notion of freedom, spontaneity, novelty at the heart of the universe. There is something that breaks the deterministic chain, quantum dimension or whatever. So there's a notion of freedom. Uh, it's post-Kantian. We're both kind of in the title of your book, Crossing the Threshold. We're both attempting to, or saying that we can hit the real. Uh, Another thing that when I was listening to you speak in a podcast you did, uh, you mentioned, I'm going to say this in different words and maybe not as well, but that there's a type of affect or a type of way of being that an aesthetic, a way of touching the real, touching reality. And in psychoanalysis, that's the same there, and that's the symptom. Basically, the symptom is where we touch the real, and the affect is jouissance, and jouissance is the name of hitting the real. Desire is for what you don't have. Jouissance is um, hitting the negativity at the heart of everything. So that it's so there's a similar thinking in what I'm doing with pyrotheology, where we hit the real. It's not a post-structuralist kind of openness to a future that's kind of like it's not a Kantian kind of the noumenal is out of reach. There is a way to touch the real, and I hear that in your work as well. Um, so those are a few of the things that I think there might be similarities: spontaneity, hitting the real. And I can't remember what the other one I said was, but where the potential differences is maybe in this notion of
Freedom. Yeah, talk more
on
freedom.
freedom. Yes, freedom's another thing. Yes, sorry, thank you. Freedom. Um, the thing that I hear, but I think I might be wrong, here's my instinct in terms of talking to process theologians, um, is that God is still an object. Like, so Lacan's critique of object relations is we have internalized objects of our mothers and fathers, and we relate to these, and how we relate to these affect our lives. And Lacan comes along and talks about his critique of object relations is he says, no, it's object A relations, it's our relation to negativity that transforms us. So in radical theology, you have a notion of like, oh, God is the name for a radical negativity. Uh, but can you riff off that comment and tell me, help me refine it? What God is within, say, process theology or within your thinking?
Yeah. Well, thanks for laying that out. Really interesting. This will be juicy. God is still an object in process theology. Yeah, I mean, I can see how there might be an easy critique of like Whitehead doing, he Process in Reality comes out in 1929, the same time as Being in Time by Heidegger, and you might read Whitehead for the first time and think, oh, he's doing ontotheology. Um, but I don't think it's that simple. So let me give an account of the motivations for his metaphysical project, um, which he undertook at a time when metaphysics was becoming rather unpopular. Um, so he discusses Aristotle and says Aristotle was the last philosopher. The theologians say to discuss God in a dispassionate and non-religious way. And Aristotle, of course, points to God as an unmoved mover, as an explanation for why there's motion in the cosmos. Whitehead says that contemporary physics doesn't have that problem, but there's an analogous issue, which for Whitehead was not the source of motion, but the source of concrete actuality. How do you go from infinite possibility to some concrete actuality? And so his, I like this term, divine function, is, I think Isabel Stengers comes up with that. His divine function is an attempt to give an account for how we move from infinite possibility to something definite. So he says in Science in the Modern World, his 1925 book, God is the principle of limitation or the principle of concretion. His ultimate category is creativity, and God is actually a creature of creativity, like the rest of us. Though what makes God different is God is the primordial creature. So God gives the first, God gives creativity a character. God values this realm of infinite possibility to give it some vector, to make some possibilities more important than others, and then that that vector, that sort of tilt added to this realm of possibilities, then is inherited by all the subsequent creatures to become as their initial aim, he says. And that initial aim doesn't determine what creatures do, but it provides a sense of relevant novelty, relevant possibility. Whitehead phrases this nicely in his book, Religion in the Making. He says, God, in this function of providing relevant novelty to each creature, is like holding up a mirror to reflect back to each creature its own greatness, what it could be. But how a creature decides to actualize itself is up to it, right? God's not determining that. So this is all the primordial nature of God. And Whitehead's account of God has these two poles to it, because he's trying to do justice both to our intuition of permanence and some sense of eternal value, while also doing justice to our sense of history, becoming, loss, perishing. And he doesn't want God to just be this distant. I came up with this term, possibilitect, sort of architect of possibility, but that God is also a fellow sufferer who is in the world, with the world, experiencing all the joys and suffering of all finite creatures. And that would be the consequent nature of God. Now, the primordial nature of God is described by Whitehead as deficient in actuality, but yearning for actuality. And so there's a lack in this primordial nature. And also the primordial nature is described as unconscious. Now, admittedly, lots of process theologians have argued over this for decades. It seems like there's two gods in Whitehead's thought. There's this primordial and consequent pole, or the mental pole of God and the physical pole of God. It's like, well, how do the two really fit together? Can God be both eternal and temporal and historical? And I think if we're able to think dialectically, yes. But that does put a sort of instability, or you could, in Hegelian terms, say a kind of negativity at the heart of this vision of the divine, that nothing is ever finally settled. God is continually being disrupted by creativity, which Whitehead also calls the principle of unrest. And so God is as subject to this creative onrush as any other creature. And it's precisely for that reason that God is not all powerful. And so the process conception of God is both as a source of refreshment and a sense of relevant novelty, but also a sense of companionship that this is not a God that exists outside the world. This is a God that exists and suffers with the world. Um, and so God is as much subject as object, as much a lack as a presence. Um, and I do think there's a radical negativity in this vision in the sense that, um, you know, the creation is never finished, uh, and nor is God actually a completed being. God is growing with each experience, with every life and death of every creature. And so there's a sense in which that divine yearning is unquenchable. And so again, I don't read this as just saying God is an object that would resolve all the tensions of life and becoming. God is not a being. God is becoming with us.
I was about to ask, actually, I mean, would you say, I was almost thinking you wouldn't say this, but maybe you would, but God is the name of the process itself. Is God a signifier of the fact that the universe is in a type of creative flux? So the signifier God just names the process itself.
I think that's fair, so that God becomes, you have creativity, which doesn't have a vector. Creativity is kind of akin to nothing or chaos and God gives it both aim and um, memory, as it were. So that process can become um, a it takes on a trajectory. It has purpose, but it's never going to arrive at some finished state. And so, yeah, Whitehead's theology is an attempt um, to provide an account of aim and memory at the cosmic scale, right? So that we would be able to describe the universe in terms of process it's not aimless process, and it's process that builds on itself, and so that something is recollected. And indeed, from Whitehead's point of view, nothing is ever forgotten. Everything which occurs becomes objectively immortal, right? And is contributing to the further creative advance of the universe. And God plays that role. So God and process, you could say, are equivalent concepts. Yeah.
Yeah. Will I jump in? Yeah, you're happy enough. Uh, okay, let me give you a definition of where I think of God, and tell me where you think that you differ. Because I'm interested as far, and as this is a conversation where I'm just really wanting to learn and tease out the differences. Um, and then, there's we both have this notion of freedom, but for me, freedom isn't agency. And so, uh, you know, uh, and I'll see what you think of this. When I talk about, when in terms of psychoanalysis, they talk about freedom. Freedom is not, obviously the ability to choose one direction over another. Um, Freedom is the name for a type of cuts within the causal chain. It's a type of, non-totality. And this is why in psychoanalysis, your freedom is connected with the symptom. It's connected with the very thing that you think you cannot control, the very thing, washing your hands excessively or something like that. And in other words, um, the freedom is where you are thrown, where consciously you'd be like, you would be a utilitarian, maximize your pleasure, minimize your pain. We have like a life drive, all of this stuff that at a conscious level, utilitarianism makes total sense. And then you do something that acts against your own self-interest, that you act in not in accordance with what would seem like the basic rules of evolutionary psychology or whatever. And this is the moment of freedom. because this is the moment of derailment of the causal chain, and an event happens, a new possibility erupts that reconfigures the past. But all of that to say, um, if you take basic classical theism saying God exists and classical atheism saying God does not exist, then, the radical theology says God is the name for the inexistent thing. So God is simply the name for the way in which everything orbits around a type of contradiction or asymmetry. Um, and and because everything revolves around a type of asymmetry, a non-totalizable kernel, um, then there's within language and within our bodies, I'll say that's a simple way. Within language, we can never say everything we want to say. There's a constant failure. And within our bodily pleasure, there is a constant failure. Like we always get commodities and they never satisfy. And so mimetically, we want other commodities, and this goes on forever. But in terms of desire, that's how desire works. But jouissance is when you hit on the negativity and you directly enjoy negativity. So if demand is you enjoy an object, and desire is you enjoy a lost object, an object that you can never get, then drive is enjoyment of loss itself. And jouissance is a connection with the affect that comes out of a direct enjoyment of circling lack. All of this to say, and this is why I feel it's less metaphysical in process. I think, that for me, I don't want to say it's like Karl Barth to me, is if you buy it at the beginning, you can take the whole thing. But if you don't buy the fundamental premise, it's hard to jump into. But within what I'm doing with pyrotheology, the idea of God as the name for the non-at-oneness of reality with itself, and religious experience as an encounter with that radical negativity, enduring and enjoying that negativity, and freedom erupts out of hitting that negativity. So anyway, that's just some thoughts. I could go deeper, but um,
So I wonder if this parallels something in process theology and Whitehead's thought, where um, he would say in every moment of our experience of what's been actualized already, so taking in the whole of our past lives, um, we're also aware of, or his term would be prehending. We might not be consciously aware of it, but we're also prehending everything which has not been actualized, right? And so this negativity, as it were, is also haloing everything that actually has been realized. And so, one of the reasons he finds it necessary as a metaphysician to make reference to God is he needs some way to account for that, all that unrealized possibility, all that negativity, as it were, that hasn't been positively actualized. And so he points to the divine as sort of the um, that which shelters these unrealized possibilities, and allows us to still be um, for those possibilities to still be accessible to us in some way, right? And so, he speaks in terms of possibility, potentiality, not in terms of negativity, but to the extent that this is um, his account of like what a thing is includes not just what it is, but everything that it's not, and definitely is building on a kind of Hegelian logic here. It's just that he wants it to be, as he says at the beginning of Processing Reality, he's seeking a kind of realism, organic realism, he says, but at the end of the day, it could just be um, equivalent to absolute idealism. Um, that that the final interpretation is actually not that divergent. Um, in terms of freedom, I've been very influenced by Schelling, and I perhaps inappropriately try to appropriate him as a process theologian and process philosopher. But his account of freedom um, in philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom. When I first read that, it really shook me because, as you're saying, this isn't like the freedom to choose this or that. This is a deeper cut or a decision that we make uh, almost primordially or
Yes, I was
eternally.
going to
It's
say a
about,
primordial decision. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that determines our character, our personality in some sense. So it's like the choice we make that is the condition for the possibility of these either or types of choices. It's like it's this freedom as this sort of self transcending creativity. And what's fascinating about Whitehead's account of decision, as it were, he calls it concrescence, and he doesn't limit it to just human beings. For Whitehead, creativity, the capacity for self-creation is uh, cosmically distributed, and human beings might be self-conscious of this capacity for decision, but it's not unique to us. We're not the only creatures capable of self-creating, even though there's a paradox in that. Um, his account of the concrescence of an actual occasion of experience um, is a process of self-creation, though also always inheriting a history and a context, but adding something novel. Um, and the way that that process works involves three basic phases: inheriting of the objectified past, subjectively experiencing that in the present, and then perishing into what he calls superjectivity, where the values we realize in that moment of subjectivity, interpreting the objective past in a unique way, is then passed on to the future for the next round of concrescence to inherit. And so, if we think about this in human terms and try to understand freedom, our capacity to creatively self-transcend or to exercise freedom to realize a free deed actually depends on dying to ourselves as subjects in the present and giving whatever value we think we have realized, uh, the effects of this decision we've made to the next concrescent subject. So for Whitehead, there's no enduring subject. First of all, I should say that. Like we are ourselves a kind of stream um, of subjects, of occasions of experience that inherit from one another very intimately. But I'm constantly in a situation of having to interpret my present self to my past self uh, in the effort to construct a future self. But the point here is that in order to affect my future selves, as it were, I have to die to myself in the present. And so freedom is in some sense self-sacrificial, as it were. Um, I don't get to experience the effects of my free decision in the present. That would be the next uh, occasion of experience that's inheriting that decision, right? And so we're constantly having to give ourselves over uh, to the future in this attempt to exercise freedom. So it's never my freedom, right? It's almost like freedom as a gift to the other who will be me in the future. But there's a sense in which my relationship to my future selves is not different in kind from my relationship to you, right? It's just a difference of the degree of intimacy of these occasions of experience as they inherit from one another. Um, so
So for
I'm
White,
jumping right into Whitehead's metaphysics, and I know it might
I was going
be
to
a
say
bit
like it's
confounding, but
very metaphysically dense. It's very metaphysically rich, and I'm always, I'm listening, going like, okay, um, yeah. So God functions for Whitehead as a way of um, uh, understanding this process. So God is a necessary dimension for even Whitehead. I've never really, I read a little bit of that, his Gifford lectures, that process and whatever, but very little. So I'm really honestly learning here, but God is a necessary hypothesis for Whitehead in order to uh, uh, give a foundation to this metaphysics. Is that right? Is that?
Yes, but he does say that God is the ultimate irrationality. Uh,
Oh
but
yeah, I
then
like that.
after, so there's something contingent about um, God's emergence out of creativity. And yet, after that contingent emergence occurs, God then becomes necessary for all subsequent uh, uh, um, creaturely activity and cosmogenesis. And so God begins as contingent and then becomes necessary. Like it didn't have to happen. It's this isn't God is not necessary being. It's not like an Anselm sort of argument. It's that I mean, in some sense, Whitehead's a radical empiricist in the Jamesian sense and says, hey, we have this ordered cosmos. It's not perfectly ordered, so God can't be all powerful, but there does seem to need to be some account given for the origins of order. Um, and so, whether that means God's a necessary hypothesis, I mean, when you say hypothesis, it means we're going to test this out. And I think that's fair. He would say that this idea of God that he has constructed, and it's a metaphysician's God. He says this might secondarily evoke religious emotion, but his primary purpose here is to make sense of the universe, to make sense of physics and biology and human psychology. Um, and so necessary hypothesis might be a fair way of phrasing it, so long as we don't mistake that for some kind of logical proof of the existence of God. This is a hypothesis rooted in his consideration of the empirical evidence and what would be the necessary condition to make what we experience, including all of our scientific understanding, possible. Yeah.
Okay, let me, because yeah, that's fascinating. And let me then give you a definition of how I think about God again and see what again let push back on what you agree with or disagree with. Um, it's because without less metaphysics really, if you take Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and I forget the mathematician who simplified it, but I'm going to use the simplification. It's very good for people who are listening and watching. If we imagine a universal computational machine that can compute anything that's computable, uh, there's one thing that it cannot compute. Uh, Similar to kind of Marx's proletariat or something, one thing that's outside the system, but there's one thing the computer cannot compute. And is if you put into the computer, this computer cannot prove that A, so this is given A, this statement is given A. This statement, the universal computational machine cannot prove that A is true. And then you put that into the machine. And if it proves it's true, then it's false. But if it doesn't prove it's true, then it hasn't proved it. So basically, you've got an idea, something that is true but not provable. So what I want to say about God is true but not provable. Um, God is the name for yes, something that is absolutely true and absolutely real and absolutely impossible to prove. God is the type of non-at-oneness of, in this example, the non-at-oneness of the mathematical system with itself, right? A sufficiently complex mathematical system cannot, there's always be something that is true but not provable. And that's simply it. So God, again, is just the signifier of this radical negativity that generates complexity. But I feel you've got a much more substantive view of God than that. That's what I'm kind of sensing. So I guess that's what I'm trying to poke and prod. Um, that more there's something I think more substantial about your approach.
Um, so Whitehead was very familiar with the limits of logic,
Yeah.
having
Yes.
worked
Yes.
with
Yeah.
having worked with Russell on the Principia and all of the paradoxes that they ran into
Yeah, because
in
of course
that
Russell's
project.
paradox is a great example. Yes, Russell's paradox is another example of that. So yes, keep going.
Right, right. I mean the liar's paradox, right?
Yeah,
A Cretan says all Cretans are liars. What do you do with that? Um, and I think while Russell and Whitehead both made a valiant effort to cash in on this the promise of logicism, which is that one could ground all mathematics in they were working with the logic of sets and eliminate any need for intuition. And all they wanted to do was really prove that 1 + 1 = 2. And they, I think we have to say the Principia was both a tremendous success and a tremendous failure. Um, a success in the sense that it inaugurated this new approach to philosophy using logical analysis, um, and the propositional functions that I think was a tremendous advance. On the other hand, the logicist project would prove to be untenable, and Gödel, a few decades later, would prove why. And Whitehead makes note of that in his last book, Modes of Thought. I think Gödel's incompleteness theorems came out in 33. Whitehead's last book was 38. And he mentions this. And Whitehead basically says that logic, we have to understand logic as a subset of aesthetics. And the reason that, you know, we have a sense of logical truths and can make logical judgments is that it's more deeply rooted in our intuitions of harmony and balance and that these are ultimately aesthetic factors. And so when he thinks of the divine, he's not thinking of a grand logician of some kind. He's thinking of a an aesthete. God is the poet of the world, he says. Not that God makes the world, but God makes something of the world, which is to say, the world is in process, creatively advancing. God can't stop it, but God is able to. God is that which allows us to make meaning of that creative onrush, despite the wreckage of history. It's that which allows us to still feel like reconciliation is possible. Um, and you could say this is akin to a kind of deferral um, of that reconciliation, that God is always to come and has never finally arrived. Um, yeah, I think there are readings of Whitehead's theology in that sense. But what's great about what Whitehead left us with this very abstract metaphysical account of the divine function, let's call it, is that you can come in there as a theologian with a religious purpose in mind, and as a person of faith looking to understand your experience. And it's like all Whitehead gave us was the barest sketch, and we can come in there and fill it in with color in a whole variety of ways. And he wanted an account. It's a theistic account, obviously, but he wanted one that would be at least that there would be something there for every religious tradition to work with, theistic or not, to make sense of the nature of the cosmos that we inhabit, whether we're Buddhists or Muslims or Jews or Christians, or various forms of indigenous spirituality and what have you. He wanted there to be. He was seeking a language that would be generic enough that everyone could recognize themselves in it to some degree, right? And so it's a very abstract, bare bones account. Um, but I think he's ultimately approaching metaphysics at this later phase of his life, decades after the Principia project, um, not as the attempt to sort of deduce the world from logical principles, but rather to begin with our human experience, including our religious experiences, the whole history of religious experience, our artistic experience, and our scientific experience, as well as our sort of hardcore common sense presuppositions, like our sense of having some degree of agency and, that um, yeah. And so his account is looking at everything that we experience across all these domains and trying to distill a set of categories which would allow us to describe it, um, metaphysically speaking, but always he wants those metaphysical categories to remain um, subject to revision in light of new experience, and in light
Right.
of yeah.
How close, yeah, I mean, how closely aligned then do you think this kind of thinking is with someone like John Caputo? I can see differences and similarities. I'm almost triangulating radical theology, weakness theology, process as as having some sort of family resemblance, but I just in terms of this openness to the future, this ongoing kind of like creative process that potentially is never finalized or finished, but God is always to come. But is this close to Caputo's work, do you think, or is it substantively different, or maybe you're not that au fait with Caputo? I don't know. Um,
Yeah, I've read a little bit of John Caputo's work. I would say there are deep resonances here. I think Catherine Keller's work would probably be the bridge here. She's engaged very deeply with post-structuralism and Derrida and Caputo, and I think has offered a reading of Whitehead that is responsive to some of their concerns about the way metaphysics was traditionally done, say, and responsive to the concerns about ontotheology. And, um, you know, I don't know if you know Catherine Keller's work so much, but she's really developing a kind of theopoetics rather than a theology, in the sense that theology could be a science or something. It's more about evoking a sense of aesthetic response to the mystery of existence, um, and shifting our relationship to God talk away from certainties and proofs, uh, more in this artistic, aesthetic, poetic direction, so that we recognize that that theology is more like it's more like painting than it is like science, if that
yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, I accept then with process, but there's still like with someone like Caputo, God is almost always to come there. That it is one of his smaller books on religion. He really picks up on uh, Augustine when he says, "What do I love when I love my God?" and the Confessions, and it's like this. There's no doubt that I love God, but there's this constant. It's a master signifier. You can never fill it with meaning. Almost like Anselm's definition of God is the name for that which cannot be named. It, like in a nutshell, the proslogia, God is the name for that which cannot be conceptualized. So God
Yeah.
is a signifier that signifies something that cannot be signified. And therefore, there is this openness and this question, this creativity. But for someone like Derrida, it's it feels more atheistic than process theology seems. It always seemed to me process theology to be in this confessional theology camp.
Mm.
Um, but I could be wrong. Again, I could be wrong about that. But that's and But it seemed like process is more standardly theistic. Then you've got your Caputo, who's more uh, atheistic, but in a kind of just that there's a continual openness, a continual slippage, a continual inability to name that draws
Mm.
us.
Yeah.
And then with someone like Lacan, it's much more God is the name for that which doesn't exist. So it's much more
Mm.
redoubled atheism. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I really appreciate about Catherine's work, Catherine Keller's work, is her engagement with negative theology and um, the way that we can't simply conceive of God as the highest being. Um, that God is as much in the lowest as in the highest, and that God is. It's true. Whitehead, as a metaphysician, throws this term around, and it can be kind of an embarrassment. I mean, I'm sitting here after an hour of us talking about God, and I've said so much, and I should admit, what I've been doing is trying as best I can to offer an account of uh, Whitehead's work here. But for me, um, this term is so both potent and pathetic at the same time. By which I mean it has tremendous um, cultural power, both to move people in a variety of directions. And so we have to be careful with it, but we also don't want to take it too seriously because we want to take ourselves too seriously when we talk about it. Um, and so, yeah, I guess I'm feeling in this moment a bit of the need for some, I'm feeling anxiety about all the God talk we've been doing and my own
Yes.
sense of complete inadequacy when it comes to actually pretending to understand how it all works. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think Whitehead provides us with me at least, with a kind of scaffolding that takes my rational mind as far as it can go, and that feels um, more or less adequate to my experience. Though, of course, there are holes, there are things that don't find a place in his otherwise somewhat miraculously comprehensive scheme. But yeah, I guess I think I find the negative theological tradition and apophasis to be extremely uh, edifying and help me as my metaphysical side, who wants to be able to spell it all out. It helps me from taking that part of myself too seriously. And
Yeah.
to the extent that there's a confessional side, I mean, yeah, like we started this with me sharing this religious experience that I had that more than any ideas, any philosophy I've ever read has shaped who I am as a human being. And in so many ways, my search for a reasonably satisfying articulation of what I experienced um, is secondary to the experience itself. And I think how it guides me ethically and the meaning that it provides me that is somewhat remains mostly actually ineffable. And I'm willing to talk about it, and I was glad that Rahul that you asked, but it's also kind of embarrassing because like I don't know what the hell happened to me, and I put these words to it. But the reason I share it openly is because it feels I was surprised by it. Um, and though I was, raised in sort of Judeo-Christian context, did not expect that to come up in my experience at all. Um, so yeah, anyways, I just wanted to sort of slow us down and pause and admit that I personally am not convinced that Whitehead's understanding of this is the best possible one we might have. Um,
I get,
and
yeah,
I
no,
think,
I
yeah, radical theologians and process theologians really need each other for this reason to keep us both honest. Like, let's push the philosophizing as far as we can, but let's not pretend like we're not still limited, finite, suffering, more or less ignorant beings.
yes, yes, no, and I appreciate you saying that, and it's interesting because the God talk is interesting just because God is kind of in a way the ultimate embarrassment, the ultimate kind of symptom, the ultimate kind of a religious experience kind of embarrasses one. It happens out of the blue. It transforms our trajectory. It's kind of so I find it a fascinating conversation. But precisely, yeah, for the reason why it's so difficult is there something about talking about the signifier God as a signifier of that cannot be signified that potentially hits on something that's central to kind of the radical tradition and the process tradition. So, but yeah, there's this fundamental limit that I love the way you're speaking, and that's kind of what makes it so endlessly fascinating. Is precisely uh, that there is that this brings us to to a type of limit. I did love in something you talked about in a podcast I listened to, and I totally agree with this. However, is that in a way we kind of weirdly have an insight into the universe because we are the universe having an insight into itself. Like we are the interiority of the universe, um, and that's why we're both post-Kantians in different ways, but there's something in which we're both saying, well, there's a limit and we're finite, but also weirdly, as the universe encountering itself and thinking itself, um, well, this is what radical theology does with this, and I think maybe it's similar to process, maybe not, but it's almost like it's not just that I am not understanding the universe. I am the universe not understanding itself. And that touches on an ontological incompleteness within the universe itself. And of course, Žižek loves the example of a computer game where someone hasn't programmed enough. So behind a door, there's nothing because the programmers didn't program it. And he uses that to say that's like quantum mechanics with God. You know, God didn't bother to program at the quantum level, thought we'd never get there. And then we opened the door and it's incomplete. So
Yeah.
we kind of down, we got to the incompleteness. So yeah. It's a way of turning the not knowing into a knowing, not knowing. But again, that's what I want to call God. I come back to yes, and the name for that ontological unknowing is God.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, Whitehead explicitly says that the universe is incomplete, that it is an incompletion in the process of production, but it will never arrive at, it will never become product. Um, and so there's a deep resonance there, and we are caught up in that. And so it's like our intuition of that incompleteness, for Whitehead would be our, to the extent that we intuit that incompleteness, we are partaking in creativity. And to the extent that we intuit some sense that there's a better and a worse, uh, uh, you know, that there's beauty and ugliness, that there's good and evil, that we have some sense of a value differentiation. That's our intuition of how the divine participates in that process of incompletion, not to bring it to completion, but to give it a direction of some kind. And so it's like there's this double intuition that we have as cosmic creatures. Maybe I should say chaosmogenic creatures to throw in a Deleuzian spin on it, because there's not just order; it's order, chaos, ongoing genesis. But as participants in that whole process, we intuit both the ongoingness of it and the radical open-endedness of it, right? The creativity of it, but also a sense that um, there's some kind of advocate, some kind of a divine eros that despite all of the chaos and disorder, Whitehead would say nature has a tendency to be in tune. What is that? Um, and we have words for it. Um, but I think we do have this double intuition, right? That touches the real, allows us to touch the real in some sense.
Well, I've always said to Trip Fuller that, if you're going to be if you're in the church, if your confessional process is probably the best one to take. So I think like if I was to have to choose one confessional theological position, probably process or Bart. I kind of have a soft spot for Karl Barth as well. Um, uh, but then, of course, implicit into that and folded into that is the idea that I can't quite bite. I can't quite make the leap. But if I did make the leap process, seems to me, I actually, even in my 20s, early 20s, there were a pile of evangelical Christians who got into, it was called, was it open theism? I think YWAM,
Mhm.
there was a YWAMer. And this is pre me doing philosophy or anything like that. But even then, I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting that within evangelicalism,
Mhm.
there was this idea of a God in process, with the future unknown and that kind of stuff, and that sounded fascinating. But yes, I am aware then that maybe we should change it to a different topic. Um, Rahul, do you want to direct us at all, or are you
Yes,
just
yes. I mean,
enjoying us talking between us?
yeah, I have heaps of notes, and I doubt we'll have time to touch on all of them. Although, I mean, I have two questions here. So one is more like a naive, just philosophical question. In fact, imbued out of a conversation I had with my partner. So like her question was like, why even have the God talk? We'll leave that for later. But one thing I'm interested in is, so I'll say this, Peter. I think I've shared this with you before. One reason early on I was drawn towards your work and then really pyrotheology is because I realized your work doesn't call for any kind of like spiritual revelation or like I don't have to be saved. As you say, there's no A to B. A is not A itself, right? So, and I was like, yes, because I myself, I'm not a spiritual person. In fact, I joke around when I say I'm religious but not spiritual. People say the other way around, right? So, and 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 I'm of two minds about this whole notion of spirituality. And I love the fact that Matt, you said that you're kind of ashamed of it because here's the thing, though, right? With these kinds of spiritual experiences, it can be just ethically speaking. For me, it's very ethically ambiguous. I'll put it this way. So you take someone like, I don't know, a fascist. In some sense, fascism itself, I would argue, has this almost like fanatic spiritual element to it too. It's like to use Žižek's terms, I am a tool of the big other. There's like a perverse structure. In fact, recently, I'm not saying he's a fascist, but he's a neo-fascist, would say, Trump. He said when the bullet, hit him, he was like, I really felt like this was God telling me to go and do what I have to do. Like God gave me a second chance. Um, and I don't know if it's a show for him, but perhaps he genuinely just believed that this was like a sign from Big Other to go and do what he has to do, like carry out his calling. And I've always been very skeptical of people that just have this strong conviction that my calling, people say my calling was to do this, and I hear this, from especially people in confessional Christianity. So just regards, yeah, spiritual experiences, I'm curious to hear, do you both think there is such a thing as an authentic spiritual experience? And like how people, because I've heard a lot of people share their spiritual experiences, like how in your view should one deal with this if they believe they've had a spiritual experience? Maybe we'll go with you, Matt, and then please, Peter.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, you bringing up the example of fascists feeling inspired by some type of deep
Or
spiritual
yeah.
spiritual experience is interesting. I mean, you could just as easily, be an atheist, sort of historical materialist who's inspired, you know, to commit atrocities because of the end you think you're serving. I mean, so this doesn't necessarily um, it's not that only religious people are vulnerable to this type of um, overconfidence in a particular dispensation that they feel they've been given. But I'm also reminded of something, I think it was in Rahul, your conversation with Peter about a year ago, where Peter, you talked about the difference between left wing and right wing enjoyment, and where left wing enjoyment is coming to terms with the inescapable alienation of life and kind of just learning to accept the contradiction inherent in the nature of existence. Whereas right wing enjoyment is like oh, this alienation could be overcome, and there must be somebody who's preventing me from overcoming it, and so let's find the scapegoats and eliminate them. Um, and I think that's obviously a danger here, and I think I don't think it's limited to just spirituality though. Any kind of ideological fixation or over certainty in one's sense of like what the solution, the final solution to the problem is going to be problematic. And if I were going to simply describe what an authentic spiritual experience would be, one of its characteristics, I think, would be humility, first of all, and a kind of ecstasis, like being outside oneself. And so, if it's authentic, you should actually feel rather disoriented initially, um, not certain of anything, but you've become a mystery to yourself, um, and that might that ontological shock might lead you to, after you know sort of shamanically dismembering you and leaving you in pieces, you might then pick up the pieces and reassemble yourself into something else. And depending on the context and your prior life experience and yeah, like who's around you, like what are the easiest you know influences ideologically that you're going to use to reconstruct a new sense of identity, like that could go in different directions, but the experience itself should be shattering, humbling, and bring you outside of yourself so that you're less certain about who you thought you were, right? And so if uh, I guess I'm distinguishing here between authentic spiritual experience and a kind of conversion. Um, I didn't experience what happened to me at 19 as a conversion. I didn't start calling myself a Christian. I didn't start going to a particular church. I still don't go to a particular church. So for me, it's not so much, it wasn't a religious conversion. It was an encounter with a being that was as real as anything I've ever experienced. I didn't need a religious or institutional context for it. I didn't need to give myself a new label afterwards. But I grant that sometimes there are conversion experiences that seem very authentic because the person is totally different afterwards. But now they're fixated on like, oh, this is the truth. Um, this is what's wrong with the world. Now I know, and I think um, that might be different than how I would want to define an authentic spiritual experience, which I think is initially not going to leave us with certainty. Um,
All
what do you
right, will
think,
I jump
Peter?
in? Yeah, so I'll outline as quickly as possible. It might take me a few minutes to a possible structure for how I think about religious experience, which I think will touch on some of what you're saying. And in some respects, it's going to sound like the opposite, of course, and then we'll find out how to square that circle, or if we can. But yeah, in terms of um, the apophatic tradition, spiritual experience is a saturated phenomenon, a phenomenon of being overwhelmed by the over proximity of that which is otherwise than being. Right? Not dissimilar from Freud's early notion of trauma as a happening that cannot be symbolized. So it's a truth, an event that overwhelms you and you cannot symbolize it. You don't have the ability to symbolize it, and so it exists as a real, as a something that is unsymbolizable. So that's kind of broadly speaking the apophatic idea, and that's the kind of experience. And you mentioned psilocybin. Like you can like that. You can name, you can go, well, that happened on the 21st of June at 5 o'clock, right? It's something that happens in history at a particular time, at a place. You can note where it happened. I've had a few of those myself, so anyway. Then there's like the existential notion of religious experience. So in Paul Tillich, what's interesting for Paul Tillich is he basically, he says God is the ground of being out of which everything arises. So his God is pre-subject object. So we are all marked by a loss. As we come out of the ground of being, we are marked by, again, using the Freud's thing of like, separation from the mother. The separation marks you eternally with a loss. And so for Paul Tillich, religious experience is the experience of loss, of desire, of ultimate concern. For the philosopher, it's truth, for the artist, it's beauty, for the activist, it's justice. But this is something that can never be got. Uh, the philosopher argues about truth, but in a sense, they're embedded in truth. So even though they can never define truth, the very argument itself testifies to what they do not have. So what I like about Paul Tillich is spiritual experience is not something that some individual has occasionally at a certain point. Spiritual experience is what everybody is having all the time. And therefore, the church is about, helping you embrace that experience of loss that marks us in our being and be driven towards ultimate concern, right? That's that. Now, then the position that I'm interested in is the position in which not that religious experience primarily is the encounter with a hyper presence that cannot be symbolized or experienced. Not simply that we are marked by a loss, and religious experience is really tarrying with that loss, realizing it, not closing it down into, as you were talking about, like into something that you can have, nation or whatever it is. It's a constant openness to the future, very Derridean. Um, but but religious experience is a loss. So all of these have negativity, by the way. So the apophatic is a negativity that comes from hyperpresence, hypersaturation. So we desire not because of a lack, but because of a overwhelming experience. But there's still a negativity. There's something you can't grasp by being overwhelmed. Now, Freud later changed his theory of trauma to what basically makes something traumatic is the unknown, the question of the other's desire in what happens. What is traumatic is what does the other want from me? He calls the das Ding of the other, that some other doesn't just abuse me, but there's a look in their face, the enjoyment they're having that cannot be expressed. Something traumatic about the unknown dimension of the other. This is key to what I think religious experience is. But so you have the apophatic, you have in Tillich negativity in a much more to core desire. We have desire. We have, the proof of religious experience is the proof of desire. We are desirous, and desire exists because there is a lost object, and that's spiritual experience. But the radical position is not that God is hyper being, nor ground of being, but rather that negativity is in the heart of God itself. Negativity is in the absolute. So, and the difference is this is similar to Freud's drive theory, is in if desire is a sense of it being a bit depressed because you can never get what will satisfy you, then drive theory is enjoying the loss, and the loss as the reception, right? The loss is the thing you want. And so that's what earlier I mentioned the joke of Žižek, which is, not a funny, but the joke is in the logic, that I experience loss, alienation, darkness, and then I realize that loss, alienation, and darkness is woven into the very fabric of the universe itself. And by identifying in a transitive way with the alienated Christ, with the crucified God, the castrated God, I that lack is forgiven, not paid, it's not filled. The nothing is rendered nothing. The lack is no longer an oppressive force. So in all of that, I want to say that very quickly, I know I'm sorry I'm taking time here, to very quickly define knowledge and belief. I want to define knowledge, and this connects with Kant a lot. Define knowledge is the one thing we know is that we do not know. Right. I can't show my working out, so I'm just going to have to say it. Everybody, believe me for a second. I'm probably not right, but let's pretend I am, right? That the one thing we can know is that there is a limit to our knowledge. Now, in the kind of Freudian Lacanian tradition, this is the idea of there's frustration, castration, privation. Frustration is the infant experiences they're hungry, but they don't get food all the time, right? There's frustration. It's inherent. We experience frustration as an infant. Castration is when you realize that the other who feeds you is also lacking. And then privation is the encounter with lack at the heart of everything, right? There's a sense in which everything is castrated. So those are the three. Now, if we take that as knowledge, what do we know? Now, I'm not talking about knowledge in terms of conscious belief. I'm talking about subjective registration. We register in our being that there is lack. And that's evidenced in our language, where we can't say everything we want to say, and in our desire, which can never be fulfilled. Then belief, I would argue, is what covers over that knowledge. Belief is ideology. Belief is the blanket we put on to avoid a confrontation with knowledge. And one of the ways that works is disavowal. I know that astrology won't tell me who I should marry. Nevertheless, I consult the stars, right? So but nevertheless you believe. So that's how I would define knowledge and belief. And then for me, uh, what I call Church of the Contradiction, the radical church, it is a ritual that is designed to um, critique belief so as you encounter the knowledge that you know, so that you directly encounter lack. You directly tarry with it. You directly engage with it. So basically, I call it a communion of non-believers. It is what the church is, communion of non-believers, a social bond based upon um, the embrace of lack without the ideological cover of belief. And here's then, sorry, and with this I'll finish. Religious experience then for me is jouissance. It is when you hit the radical negativity, like with a little hammer, you hit the rail. Um, the affect is jouissance, which in effect is an absolutely overwhelming experience, like being on psilocybin. It can be an absolutely anxiety producing and intense experience of the lack. And that's why I think a genuine religious experience cannot be neo-fascist or fascist in the sense of it is it is a direct confrontation with a fundamental alienation that is enjoyable. Yeah.
Hmm. I mean, I resonate with all of that. The term that comes to mind is kenosis, self-emptying. A genuine spiritual experience is self-emptying, right? And
Yes.
so I think that
Yeah. I mean,
inoculates it against the
yes.
fascist appropriation.
Yeah, and just on that, thank you. That's brilliant. To add one thing is because I lived in LA for many years, and religious experience in LA is very much seen as a really nice experience, something wonderful, something you want to invite, something amazing, something that you want to go up to the mountain, you want to do your ayahuasca retreat. It's something. Even if it's going to be difficult, you kind of want it. But I think the interesting thing about Christianity is the Christian experience is crucifixion. It's precisely affliction. It's precisely a type of radical suffering. And I think Simone Weil is brilliant on this. I'm sure Simone Weil has some resonance. From listening to you, I was like, oh, I think
Yeah.
some of what you say reminds me of Weil, and I love Weil. But it's like you cannot want religious experience. For Simone Weil, it's like you can't want that because who wants crucifixion? Who wants affliction? Who wants to identify with Christ? And subjective destitution is what Lacan calls it. There's actually something that we consciously cannot want. We can't consciously want our own destruction, our own be derailment. We're condemned to freedom, as Sartre says. I love that thing. We don't want freedom. Freedom is horrific. But religious experience is when we hit the rail, and it's awful and amazing. And I don't think we can want it. I think I loved what you said about it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. It's scandalous. It's ridiculous. Um, and for me, it is where we encounter the truth.
Mm.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think that's where if there's any kind of what I would call bridges or synergies, that's where I see it. Because yeah, like I've been really thinking about this notion of people, they call it, come to Jesus or having like this conversion. And it's interesting, right? Like some may say, whatever public figures, when they say, "Oh, I found Christ, I'm a Christian now," that some may say, "Oh, it's this is like cultural Christianity or like political." So one person I can name here is this. She was a big atheist, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was a part of like the Richard Dawkins group, and recently she became a Christian, and she is what you would, as you say, Matt, be called a cultural Christian. However, for me as a Lacanian Žižekian, I think, as we all know, that the truth is out there. It's so even if it's some kind of performance, that is her truth. And then I'm always questioning, well, yeah, I mean, as you would mention, like, is this what spirituality or like an authentic moment is? However, I think it's I like the way you outline the differences, Peter. Okay, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, guys. This is really my last question, and the reason I want to keep it here is I recently have been trying, I'd say recently in the past 6 months or so, just like almost naively revisiting these fundamental philosophical questions like, what is the good life, Aristotle, like kind of really Plato, trying to get through these works. Um, and and of course, religion is a part of this. So a bit of a story here. Sorry, I'm being a bit long-winded, but I was having a conversation with my partner. My partner is not religious at all. In fact, she gets annoyed whenever I mention religion. And then I was kind of trying to outline some of your work, Peter, and of course, Matt, your work. I'm trying to like show that, like for her, I think her religion's really the religion of like growing up in a church, that sort of confessional Christianity. So she sees, I'm like, no, there are other ways to work through religion. And then, like, for instance, as you mentioned, Peter, for you, God might be a signifier for lack. And then perhaps for you, Matt, if I might say, God is a signifier for creativity. And then one thing she mentioned, which I think is a good point, I kind of agree with her, is like, yeah, I mean, why even use the religious language? Why even have God? Like, doesn't God overcomplicate things here? So I mean, I have my own way of answering that, but I'm curious to hear if someone like that really like let's say hard-nosed Richard Dawkins type atheist comes and says, yeah, why even put the word signifier of God or Jesus or whatever you may call it, and just speak of the thing as the thing without putting this other, let's call it superfluous signifier. How would you both respond to that sort of let's say critique?
Yeah, he wants to go first.
Maybe Matt, you can go first, and then Peter.
I'm sympathetic to that critique. You use a word like God, and it will be understood in a whole variety of different ways by different people. And I also don't believe in the God that Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in. So I think it's a problematic term, and yet sometimes you just have to dive in there and activate um, all of that cultural history and all of the contemporary controversy. Um, so you throw out a word like that to signify that you want to get into that stuff. And if there ever was a word that's difficult to define, I mean, I don't know how many people who, especially who haven't cracked open any of Whitehead's books, will understand a word of what I was trying to say earlier about the primordial, the consequent nature, and all of this. Um, and so I'm sympathetic to the critique of the use of such language when we don't mean uh, this, as process theologians say, we don't mean the traditional omnipotent creator God. Um, and yet at the same time, I wouldn't want to so sever my connection to that whole lineage with there's something hubristic in thinking, oh well, we could just start over and I'll invent a new language and won't have to deal with all that baggage. It's sometimes I feel it's actually more. It's not just a strategic move, but I'm actually able to communicate more effectively by using the word, but saying, oh, okay, this God, we've been imagining God as a creator, but what if God is more like the relator, not the creator? Like, in other words, the condition for relationship. Um, then all of a sudden, like you still have the resonance with this older concept of God, but you're twisting it, you're transforming it. And so there's continuity, but there's also a difference. And I feel like that can still be powerful. And if we throw out the word entirely, then sometimes I'm not sure that we're still able to address the depths of human experience in the right way. And you know, there may be other languages that allow us to get to that level of depth. Um, but the G word is such an effective uh, stick of dynamite sometimes that I'm hesitant to totally do without it.
Yeah, for me, and this is where, I think both Matt and I, in different ways, find this signifier to be vitally important, right? So, and I'll say why I think it is, is it for me? So, right at the beginning, say the signifier God with Anselm, and you see it in Suda and Asia, but almost God is a signifier that names something that cannot be signified. So already it's like the zero. It's when mathematics created zero, they had a symbol for nothing, and in fact supposedly that was very controversial. Some people thought it was the devil's number, right? Because God is everything. What is sin, what is devil, lack, the kind of the privation. So the devil's number is zero because you're naming privation, you're naming nothing. But in a way, God was this signifier that signifies that which cannot be signified. Say Anselm built a whole, ontological argument that, uses this, but that if you can conceive of if I can conceive of God, then I can conceive of something greater than God, which is namely, I can conceive that there is something I cannot conceive, right? And you can't conceive of something greater than God, so therefore God must be greater than conception, right? And that's just, so already you have this signifier. So what, in psychoanalysis is called a master signifier. Um, for me, religion at its best has always been about negation, right? Then signifying something that can be signified. This is vitally important. For me, God, and this is why Christianity is very vitally important to me, is uh, the crucified God, the dead God, means also that this negativity is not simply because God is beyond all understanding, but this negativity is in the heart of the absolute, which is a mythological way of saying that lack is woven into everything. So the crucified God image for me is the privileged way of describing the non-oneness of the universe with itself. And I think in terms of the modern world, in biology, this was evolution, the non-oneness of the organism, which creates, biological complexity. In mathematics, Gödel's incompleteness theory, the kind of contradiction within mathematics that kind of allows for the mathematical system. In politics, democracy, the non-oneness of the political body with itself that creates civilization. In physics, kind of, wave particle duality, superpositioning, the non-oneness of physical reality with itself. In psychoanalysis, the unconscious, not as a substantive thing, but rather as the non-oneness of subjectivity with itself or of consciousness with itself. So the subject is not a thing. The subject is the eruption of the non-oneness of consciousness, right? But all of those for me are subspecies of the crucified Christ. Um, and what you get in the Apostle Paul is in a cultic way. He goes like, there's something significant about the idea of an alienated God, of a crucified God. There's something salvatory about that. Then Luther raises it to the dignity of theology. Then Hegel to the dignity of philosophy. Then Nietzsche to an existential salvatory event. And then Freud and Lacan, I think, create the technology of the death of God, right? That's my genealogy in a nutshell. I think I've shared that before in your podcast. But uh, so in a world of pure positivity, seize the day, be all that you can be, maximize all of that. The idea that of a pure negativity of a nothing is as scandalous now as it ever was. And for me, as I said, like theology says God exists, atheism says God does not exist. But this idea, Simone Weil talks about God as the name of the inexistent thing. I think that we have to have a way, not only a name for this negativity, we need a liturgy of negativity. So more important than God, I'm arguing for God here, but hey, I'll argue for the church, even more important, right? Which is a liturgy that through music and comedy and art and ritual and spoken word and storytelling in this liturgical space, you encounter lack, privation, unknowing in the art. You you introject that, and through the liturgy, you're able to embrace this negativity and live into the world, right? These are not just things that I think are important. I've dedicated my life to God and the church, in the Church of the Contradiction and this signifier God, because I think they're absolutely vital. I think that when we lose the negativity, um, it's disastrous. No, you can't lose it. I mean, that sounds silly because you can't lose it. For me, it's everywhere all the time happening. But when you cover over it with a blanket of belief, with a blanket of ideology, you end up with incredibly destructive societies and worlds. So I'm not only advocating for God as the name for the non-at-oneness of everything with itself, Christ as identifying with that non-at-oneness within yourself, but liturgy as playing out in a scene, like in a perverse sadomasochistic scene or whatever, where you create a scene where you play something out. The Church of the Contradiction creates a scene in which you play out the opposite of the perverse fantasy, the sadomasochistic fantasy, where the other is complete, right? The fetish is the object that makes you think the other is complete. But this is a non-fetishistic scene in which you encounter the radical negativity of everything, so that you discover that nothing lives, in a sense that lack exists, nothing binds. What unifies us all, what joins us, the social bond, is that we all have lack and nothing saves, that there's an emancipatory dimension to this encounter with radical asymmetry.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Peter, if you recall, you had a conversation with Cadell on his, on Philosophy Portal, and like one thing I even commented on the video saying that, I mean, I see this in both of your works really. It's this notion of an immanent critique. So like, and that's more effective, like the way Hegel does with metaphysics. You don't start with really any presuppositions, except you go into the system and critique it from within. And
Yeah.
I think that's where there can be genuinely something new that can come out of it, because like, of course, which is why, as you pointed out, Matt, yeah, the interest in new atheism, it's really, I mean, I don't even know if the movement exists anymore in any proper way. And I think one reason is,
Cadell has a great analysis of that, by the way. Have you heard Cadell talk about this? Sorry for interrupting,
Mhm.
but
oh
he
no,
says like the Hegel's phenomenology, Hegel in the second part goes from reason to spirit to religion to absolute spirit, to absolute knowledge. And he says that it's interesting because when the new atheists were there, like that was reason, that was like, Dawkins, there was a real thing. And so we'll take Dawkins as the paradigm of reason. And then Sam Harris gets spiritual. And so you see Harris and Dawkins arguing, and they can't understand each other. And Dawkins like, what are you talking about? So Harris, so out of new atheism comes spirituality. Nobody saw that coming. And then out of that, then you see Harris and Peterson talk. And Harris is like, I don't understand what you're doing, Peterson, as this transition to religion. And what the transition that hasn't happened is to absolute knowledge, right? That's it. But I thought whenever Cadell did an analysis of from Dawkins to Harris to Peterson, I did go, that honestly was hard to see. I like to try to think that I'm good at that kind of stuff, but I didn't think new atheism would the dark internet, the dark web and all that would, you know, go into a form of spirituality a la Harris and then a form of Jungian religiosity a la Peterson. Very interesting. Sorry. Anyway, back to you,
No, I mean,
Rahul.
this was the point. Thank you, Peter. That was the point I was trying to make. I mean, the problem is, of course, the radicality of Hegel, for me at least, in my own, naive reading, is that it's that leap to absolute knowing. That's like that, because that's where you almost have this subjective restitution, right? I mean, beautiful soul and then absolute knowing. So yeah. Now, gentlemen, this has been
That's where I
lovely.
would put Žižek, by the way, because Žižek debated Peterson, and
And
Peterson didn't have
yes,
a clue what Žižek was doing. So, like, yeah, I would just add Žižek as the example of absolute knowledge.
yeah,
And when Peterson was talking to Žižek, Peterson had no idea.
yeah. In fact, I
Hmm.
remember in the debate, Peterson even it was a bit patronizing, I think, asked Zizek, why do you call yourself a Marxist? Why not call yourself a Zizekian or have your own kind of philosophy? But yeah, as I was saying, gentlemen, thank you. This has been lovely. It's been fun. I really admire you both the way you're thinking, and I'm a student of you both, so this has been truly a privilege for me.
Well, thank you. And Rahul, your podcast is incredible. It's very humbling for you to say that we had a part in your development because now I look at what you're doing and who you're interviewing, and I'm like, whoa, man, you are doing it's incredible work. So, like, yeah, absolutely brilliant to see, mate. And I was resistant to this conversation because I felt like I didn't know enough about process to bring anything to the table. But you pushed me. I really enjoy this conversation. And Matt, I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I didn't realize you're in LA. I will probably be back there at some point. Are you still in California or
Northern California, actually.
Northern
I'm up
California?
in
Okay.
San Francisco, Oakland, Bay Area.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. A bit further out than me. Well, I'm hoping to find myself living out in that part of the world again soon.
Oh,
So if that happens, I'll enjoy chatting in person with you.
absolutely. And hindsight's 2020, but I think if we ever do have another conversation, we might actually start with Schelling instead of Whitehead because I feel like Schelling's work is the seed for so much of Tillich's work and Žižek's Žižek's work, and like we might actually find more common ground, so to speak. A very important concept for Schelling, the difference between ground and existence and in the nature of the divine and whatnot, and the lack and the desire in the divine ground. Anyways, that's something I'd love to have a chance to speak with you with at some point, and maybe we can do it in person. So let me know if you come out to
Wonderful.
California. Uh,
Wonderful.
and thanks, Raul. This has been a real joy. Um, to think more about what kind of joy exactly, but it's been enriching and has left me with a lot to ponder. So yeah, thank
Lovely.
you both.
Thank you both. Right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.